Good evening. My name is Ryan Mita, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and the American Civil Liberties Union, I am pleased to welcome you to this event with Susan Herman. She's joining us to discuss her latest book, Taking Liberties: The War on Terrorism and the Erosion of American Democracy. Susan Herman is one of the many exciting events Harvard Bookstore is hosting this fall. On Friday, the award-winning actor John Lithgow discusses his new memoir, and on October 5th, physician Deepak Chopra and physicist Leonard Mlodinow engage in a thought-provoking discussion. Tickets are available, but they are going fast. These upcoming events and more are listed online at harvard.com. You can follow us on Twitter, become our fan on Facebook, or pick up an event schedule near the information desk. After Susan's words, we've set aside time for your questions, and after your questions, there will be a book signing at this table, and copies of Taking Liberties are available at the registers. A friendly reminder that now is a great time to switch off or silence your cell phones. I am delighted to introduce Susan Herman. After serving the National Board of the American Civil Liberties Union for 20 years, she was elected president in 2008. She has previously co-edited Terrorism, Government, and Law, and in 2006 she authored The Right to a Speedy and Public Trial. Taking Liberties is a focused, thorough account of the federal government's panicked response to 9/11 and the rollback of American civil liberties. Filled with unsettling stories of ordinary people caught in the government's dragnet, Herman's essential book vividly details the intrusive reach of federal surveillance. In their summary, the tough critics at Kirkus Reviews call Taking Liberties, quote, a valuable contribution to the literature regarding the war on terror's impact on our constitutional rights. Linda Greenhouse of the New York Times adds, quote, by showing what has happened to real people, Susan Herman offers the wake-up call we need. Before I turn things over to Susan, I'd like to personally thank you for buying books from Harvard Bookstore. Your participation supports an independent bookstore and ensures the future of this author series. Without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Susan Herman.
Thank you, Ryan. And let me say how happy I am to be here for two reasons. First is people tell you that they don't do book tours anymore for authors, but you can't prove it by me because I'm about to go on a very elaborate book tour doing all the West Coast in 1 week, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, LA. And so this is actually my out-of-town tryout. I've had a book launch party and a few events in New York City, but this is my first thing out of town, so you're my road audience. The other reason I'm especially happy to be here is I wanted to focus tonight on books, partially because I wrote a book, but partially this is a bookstore. And bookstores are so much part of the story that I'm telling, booksellers and librarians. Jeffrey Mayerson, who's the owner of the Harvard Bookstore, who I'm sure some of you know or know about, is somebody who recently was an important plaintiff in the American Civil Liberties lawsuit that we recently won, American Booksellers for Free Expression versus Oakley, which was about internet censorship under a Massachusetts law. And the Massachusetts legislature, after we won this case, actually agreed to limit the amount of censorship going on the internet. So we have Jeffrey to thank for that. We also have booksellers and librarians to thank for the fact that they were really the first people, I think, to begin to sound the alarm, in addition to the ACLU, about what it was that we were jeopardizing after 9/11 by a lot of our theories of enforcement, which I'm going to be talking about. It was librarians who first started to think that it really was a problem if the government was going to know too much about what people were reading. And they were the ones who really became concerned about the USA Patriot Act. The book that I've written, when people talk about anti-terrorism things, I think most people think about Guantanamo and torture and things like that. And the reason that I wrote this book was actually, my book is not about that. And my opening anecdote, which I saw some of you browsing through, which I don't need to read most of the things from this book. I'll just tell you about what they say because I've seen them a few times, as you know if you've written the book. The reason that I wrote this book was that one night I was having dinner. I'm sitting next to this woman who's not an ACLU member, but she knew that I was involved with the ACLU. So she said, so tell me what the ACLU is doing lately, but don't tell me about that Guantanamo stuff. She said, I'm so sick of hearing about that. Why should I care about those people? They're not even Americans. So do you all have answers to that? We all know why she should care about that. But it seemed to me that there was another part of the story, that everybody was so upset about Guantanamo and torture and all the kinds of things we were doing around the world with actual terrorism suspects, that we were letting the opportunity go to tell people how the war on terror affected ordinary Americans. So that's the story that I set out to tell. And I think where I'd like to start the story, since we're in Massachusetts, is I'd like to start in Franklin, Massachusetts. Anybody know where Franklin is? Okay, so the locals all know. So Franklin, not surprisingly, got its name from Benjamin Franklin, who is one of the great Americans. I'm sure some of you have read biographies of Benjamin Franklin, always very quotable, very interesting person. So when Franklin decided to name itself after Benjamin, they asked him to bless their effort by sending them a church bell. Apparently they thought that was a proper acknowledgement and thanks for their naming the town after him. So some while later, the town of Franklin, newly named, gets a great big heavy box, shipped from Benjamin Franklin, and they open it up, and it's not a church bell. What it is a bunch of books. And Benjamin Franklin has sent a cover note saying, I think it was in a cover note, saying, sense is better than sound. So that to me is the beginning. I have 2 chapters in here about librarians, and one of them I actually start with some of these anecdotes about the history, the important intellectual history of public libraries and bookstores in America, how books are really so much of what our culture is about and so much of what makes our American form of democracy. One other Benjamin Franklin story. Benjamin Franklin, you may know, and his friends started the first lending library in Philadelphia. They just all started pooling their books and sharing them with each other, and that became the Library Company of Philadelphia. The first public library in the country, so far as we know, was in Franklin, Massachusetts, because they had all these books. So they were trying to figure out what to do with them, so they started a public library. Thomas Jefferson, another one of our framers of the Constitution, had such a large collection of library books that when the British burned down the Library of Congress during the War of 1812, it was restocked and started again with books from Thomas Jefferson's collection. So the tradition of librarians and people who love books being the custodian of our intellectual tradition is really not new. We have important historical precedents for that. Post 9/11 was not the first time that librarians had cause to be alarmed that the government was trying to enlist them as enforcement agents. I don't know if any of you knew this. I hadn't known about this chapter, but there is in our history. But there was a program called the Library Awareness Program that the FBI was running during the Cold War. And what they did was they went around to librarians and they asked the librarians to please tell them if anyone with a foreign accent was checking out books. And of course what they were looking for was Russians. They were trying to figure out what are those Russians up to. So there was this whole program. The librarians weren't supposed to tell anybody that this was happening. And what happened, and this is going to sound a little familiar from recent events because history repeats itself, the New York Times did an expose on the Library Awareness Program in 1987. And all of a sudden, the librarians are shocked, and people from the Library Association are saying, what? You expect librarians to be able to know who's a spy? That's not what we're trained to do. This is shocking. How can you come into the libraries? So what happened after this incident was that just about every state passed a special law to guard the privacy of library books and library information, so that the government could not find out who was taking out what books. And it really was a response to this incident. The couple of states that don't actually have a privacy law saying library records are special, the government can't get them without a real serious court order. They have to really have a good reason. And you all know enough about the Fourth Amendment, the amendment that says that the right of the people to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. Well, the general idea of the Fourth Amendment is that it's an unreasonable search and seizure if the government does a search of your house or whatever, or if they arrest you, if they don't have, number one, probable cause, like a good reason why they're coming after you, and number two, a court that's reviewed whether or not they have probable cause, so you have a neutral second opinion. So that was the idea of all these library privacy protection laws, was that in order to, nobody ever claimed that the government can never get a library record or find out what people are reading, but the idea is you have to have a really good reason, and you have to get past a neutral court, so that just you have some oversight, you have some checks and balances. Well, after 9/11, you've all heard of the USA Patriot Act, right? It's probably come to your attention as an educated group that we recently had a 10th anniversary of 9/11. Anybody mention that to you? Yeah. Well, we're about to have the 10th anniversary of the USA Patriot Act. About 6 weeks after 9/11, Congress passed this whole grab bag full of amendments to previous law. The Patriot Act, my copy printed out at about 300 pages. So when people say the Patriot Act, there is so much stuff in there, you couldn't believe. But some of the provisions that people really focused on were, were the surveillance provisions. And one in particular came to be known as the library provision. Now this provision was actually Section 215 of the Patriot Act. And here's what it said. It said if government agents want to find out what people are reading, if they want to get any record at all or any tangible thing from any custodian of records or anybody who has a tangible thing, all they have to do is go down to a special court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Huh? These are American libraries, American agents, but that's where this ended up. Another story, if you want to talk about that later, I'm happy to. But they go to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. The agents fill out an affidavit saying, we believe that if we get records from that person, about that person, that we might find something relevant to a terrorism investigation. We're not saying that person has done anything suspicious. We're just saying maybe that's going to lead us to more information. So you say that to the court, and what does the court do? Well, the statute says the court must issue the order. They must issue the order either as requested or maybe modified. What doesn't the court do? The court doesn't have anything to decide. In the usual search warrant situation, the agents go to the court, they say, hey, we think we have probable cause to believe that that person has done something criminal, and therefore we want to search her house and her basement for the following things, and they have to be very particular. The judge then looks at that, and the judge says, well, okay, so do we have enough information here that that's an okay thing to do? But in this situation, Section 215, the court has no role to play. So to me, this court order is kind of a fig leaf. It's just, it's not really a court order. So the librarians were very concerned about this because they just thought it wasn't right, that this could be something that could be used in a library to find out what people are reading. And let me tell you, I'll tell you right now, their concern was not hypothetical. There's one incident that I describe in Washington State where there was an FBI agent who actually came to a librarian and demanded to know who had checked out a particular biography of Osama bin Laden. Okay, that's exactly what it was that the librarians thought shouldn't be happening. One of my favorite quotes in the book, the little quotes you have to have at the beginning of the chapters? Well, one of my favorites, and this in some ways, this really summarizes a lot of what the book is about. It's a quote from Elaine Scarry. Anyone know Elaine Scarry from Harvard? I thought it would be appropriate to mention since here we are at Harvard. So here's what Elaine Scarry says, because she always puts everything more elegantly than anyone else. This is the Patriot Act inverts the constitutional requirement that people's lives be private and the work of government officials be public. It instead crafts a set of conditions in which our inner lives become transparent and the workings of government become opaque. Because I think that's right. It inverts the preconditions of democracy. We're transparent to the government and they're opaque to us. She says either one of these outcomes would imperil democracy. Together, they not only injure the country, but also cut off the avenues of repair. So that's sort of what we were up against. Why does the Patriot Act do this? Why was it setting out all these dragnets and saying we want to make it really easy for the government to go in there and get records from whoever, not just libraries, but hospitals, schools, internet service providers, anybody who keeps records on you? Well, the idea, there's a kind of a dragnet idea behind the whole Patriot Act and a lot else of what the government did after 9/11. And the idea is, well, what if there's a terrorist out there? And this would be a way to find them. And we might not find them any other way. We better have these really broad dragnets because that's going to enable us to have the tools that are required. You know what USA Patriot Act stands for? Okay, visualize. If I had like a PowerPoint, I would put up USA Patriot Act, visualize USA PAT, etc. The name of the act, USA Patriot, is actually the nickname, it's the acronym. The actual name of the act is Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. Okay, so right in the title, how's that for swagger? 6 weeks after 9/11, we knew exactly what tools were required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. Okay, and one of them was, okay, we have to give the government the power to find out whatever they want about whoever they want, because if we don't, what if? They might miss something. They might not be allowed to get something. It might be a problem. And this is a good way to make sure they can know whatever they want. Now, in surveillance, as in all other areas, of course, once you lay out a really broad dragnet, you also get the unintended. So Section 215, as the librarians recognized, were clearly allowing innocent people's records to be looked at by the government as well. Well, one question that I get from a lot of people, and I don't know if you think, it would be interesting to discuss later whether you think this is generational. Some people think it is, some people think it isn't. So a lot of people say, well, why should I care if the government knows everything about me if I'm not doing anything wrong? Okay, does that resonate with you? Okay, a lot of people say that, why should I care? Amazon knows everything about me. They know every single book I read. They say, you like this book, we think you're gonna like that book. I always get annoyed at that. I think I will not like that book. Yeah, how do you know? But so the question is, well, what's different if the government knows everything about you compared to Amazon? Well, Amazon is doing all this market research, and apparently all this algorithmic stuff really works to figure out whether you're going to like this book, if you like that book. They have, a lot of information, a lot of studies, and they can do that. They can get pretty good at using this for marketing and prediction. What's different about the government is two things. Number one, Amazon, so far at least, can't lock you up. Okay, if the government has information about everything that you're doing, I won't ask you this question, but think secretly. Studies show that most people, the vast majority of people have done something that violated some law somewhere, right? It's a tax thing or whatever. Okay, and it's usually like, the government doesn't find it because they don't know every single thing about you. But if the government can go trawling through all of your records, that means that they get power over you. It's the Elaine Scarry idea. The power balance is shifting, and more is going to the government. Why is that a problem? Well, they could be using their power to target their political opponents. There were a lot of concerns, a lot of claims under the Bush administration that he was targeting, or his people were targeting people who showed up and protested against him, people who were anti-war, people who were dissenters. So it could be used as a way to suppress dissent. It could also be used in a discriminatory fashion. The government might be looking for people who are of a particular religion. Again, this is not just hypothetical. There are a lot of people, a lot of the stories I tell begin with, and by the way, he was a Muslim. And so, the government finds out that you're a Muslim, and then they start reading backwards. Well, if you're a Muslim, reasoning backwards, if you're a Muslim, then you must have done this. And if there's a question, then it must be that you did this because, and they start constructing all these stories that have led to some devastating consequences that I describe for individual people. So I think the third reason why it really matters what the government knows about you is that the whole idea, again, that thinking and books and ideas are the meat of democracy. We can't have democracy if people don't have ideas, if they don't have read things and talk about things and share ideas. And if the government knows everything about you, the balance of power shifts. Plus, I think there's also a kind of chilling effect. And I think a lot of us felt that in the fall of 2001 and after. If you know that anything you tell anybody is going to be one step away from the government data banks, how are you going to affect your own conduct? How are you going to limit what you do? So there was concern about people not only being unwilling to check out the biography of Osama bin Laden, but with the idea that if you wouldn't want the government to know that you had gotten an AIDS test, say, you would want to pay for the AIDS test in cash. Or you would be concerned if you went to Yemen on vacation that the government would be suspicious, so you wouldn't go to Yemen, you'd go to the Grand Canyon. And this is what Michel Foucault talked about at one point. He talks about when prisoners are under the view of the guard all the time, at some point you internalize the gaze. And so I think that's part of what's happening. It's like, you know the government is watching, and therefore you start modifying your behavior in various kinds of ways. So those are the basic kinds of concerns that I think the librarians had. And so one very interesting person, one nice thing that I really had to work very hard to make happen in this book is I have pictures. You wouldn't believe getting photo permissions is much harder than writing a book, if any of you are thinking about that. So there's this one remarkable man who I have a picture of right here. You can't really see it, but you can later. George Christian. He was with the Library Connection of Connecticut. You heard about the Connecticut librarians at the time? Okay, well, here's what happened with George Christian. So Library Connection served a consortium of Connecticut libraries, and they were like their internet providers. You all know that every single library now has internet. They all have the computers that people can use. So in addition to books, the Library Connection was really servicing all the libraries and helping them with all their internet systems and problems, etc. So George and several other people at Library Connection, when the Patriot Act came down, they were very concerned about the library provision. They were among the people saying, wait a minute, what's this? And they were talking among themselves about, well, what do we do if the FBI comes into our library and starts asking for questions about who does what? So, some libraries adopted a system of, at the end of each day, they just destroy, they burn up the log of who used the computer, so they just don't have it. And librarians had a lot of different answers to what they were going to do. But what was happening at the time, in the fall of 2001, was that John Ashcroft, you remember him? He was Attorney General at the time. And what he was saying to the librarians was, oh, you're just being hysterical about nothing. There was really no problem here, he kept saying. And they kept saying, well, but what if? And the government could. And so what he finally did was he announced that he was going to, quote, declassify information about how this provision was being used to make everybody calm down. At the time, part of the secrecy idea was the government was using what they called the mosaic theory. And the idea was that every tiny little piece of information about how we are approaching terrorism could be helpful to our enemy, and therefore we should just have radio silence, nobody here learns anything. So he thought that it was a national security problem for anybody to know whether the library provision was being used in libraries or anywhere else. But the librarians, not as silent as their stereotype, were kind of getting enough public interest in this whole problem that he then calls a press conference and he says, all right, everybody, I'm going to tell you, we've never used the provision yet, and we certainly never used it in libraries. Okay, they hadn't used the provision because they hadn't kind of gotten up to speed on the procedures at the time. But he says we've never used it in libraries. So George Christian said to me, those of us who are trying to figure out how are we going to meet challenges if the government comes to us for information, relaxed. They said, okay, well, never mind, there's no problem. He said, we shouldn't have done that. We were fooled. So there were some librarians at the same time as George Christian and his colleagues were having these discussions about how are we going to handle this provision, who were extremely troubled and mystified by John Ashcroft's statement, because in fact they had FBI agents in their libraries asking them for information about library patrons. And they're thinking, wait a minute, how can this be? Now, one reason why they hadn't said anything, why we didn't hear about them publicly, was that the requests for information that they had gotten said at the bottom, as do the library provision orders and everything, say at the bottom, you're not allowed to tell anybody ever that we have asked you for this, period. Okay, you're going to be in violation of federal law if you ever tell anyone that we asked. So some librarians, not George Christian, are sitting there scratching their heads and thinking, whoa, sounds like the Attorney General is telling everybody things that aren't true because we know we're being asked for stuff. Well, it turns out, technically, what Ashcroft was saying was true, because they were not going to the librarians under the library provision, section 215. They were going under a different authority, which in some ways is better, in some ways it's worse. National security letters, have you heard about those? Okay, what the national security letter provision provides, and this was something that was amplified after 9/11 by the Patriot Act, is that federal agents, not only the FBI, the Department of Defense was doing this, bunch of different federal agents, can ask, again, they can ask a custodian of records to turn over records just because they want to. And this is no court order at all. It's not even only a fig leaf court order. It's like they say among themselves, they say, oh, we think we might find something relevant to a terrorism investigation, and therefore we're going to go say, you have to give us those records and you can never tell anyone that we asked. Okay, now that's pretty scary. So now on the one hand, this is worse than the library provision because there's no court at all. Both of them have these extreme gag orders. But where it's a little better is you can't get as much information under the national security letter as you can under the library provision. Under the library provision, you can get all the contents of the records. You can say to the librarian, who checked out the biography of Osama bin Laden? How many times is this person, etc. Under the national security letters, which are somewhat more limited in audience, they're limited to telecommunications providers, internet service providers, and financial institutions, bunch of other people. You're not allowed to have the content of records, but you can get name and address and subscriber information, and arguably, the interpretation of this has vacillated over time. If you ask an internet service provider, you could find out all of the websites somebody had visited and all of their to and from email addresses. Now that's not content. They're not allowed to look at the email. And I've talked to some magistrate judges who were they had to learn a lot technologically about keystrokes to figure out how they were going to get the government to not look at the content of an email if they were only looking at the address. They kind of travel together. But apparently there was a way to do that. You could figure out the keystrokes to kind of separate the two, we hope. But that was the difference. So what happened to George Christian is one day he is across from the tennis courts in Mattituck, Connecticut, and an FBI agent comes up and serves him with a national security letter. And he hadn't known that this was a possibility because nobody was talking because they weren't allowed to talk. So George Christian gets this thing, and it's asking for information about Connecticut library patrons. Well, George was extremely troubled by this. So he decided, even though the gag order said don't tell anybody, period, he decided he would consult a lawyer. So he went to see a lawyer in Connecticut. The lawyer had never heard of national security letters. But fortunately, the lawyer had an intern who knew how to do legal research, and the intern found that there had been one case already about the constitutionality of national security letters. And this was a case that was brought by the ACLU, and it was brought on behalf of an internet service provider who was called John Doe. The case started out being called John Doe versus Ashcroft. Then it was John Doe versus Gonzalez. Then it was John Doe versus Mukasey. Then it was John Doe versus Holder. 6 years this case lasted. And for 6 years, John Doe was not permitted to tell anybody that he was the person who brought that lawsuit because of the gag order. The gag order was part of what he was challenging. He wanted to be able to say who he was. He and George Christian, one of the chief things that they also wanted to do was they wanted to testify before Congress and tell Congress about this whole business of the two different provisions. So George in particular was very infuriated by this. He said, here's the Attorney General misleading Congress, saying your library records are safe and your library records are not safe. And I get, he said, John Doe and the later John Does, George Christian and his colleagues, always agreed that they would not tell anybody who the government was investigating. That they agreed, okay, that is national security. If the government wants to know, something suspicious about whatever, we won't tell that. But we want to tell about our own experiences. We want to tell what it's like and that it's very burdensome and, it's, whatever, there's no court. And it was something Congress didn't know. Well, because of the gag order, the government took the position that nobody was allowed to talk to Congress about their experience, period. That if they wanted to write an anonymous letter to Congress to say, by the way, this could happen, they couldn't sign their name to it. They were not allowed to talk to Congress. Now, erosion of American democracy, cutting off the avenues of repair. So I thought that this was really a problem. So what George did, he was in a very sticky situation because he had an entire board of directors at Library Connection and he wasn't allowed to tell anybody. So he hears about the first John Doe who's brought a lawsuit where there's actually been some success. We won something, we got a good judge in New York. And the judge said, whoa, these gag orders really sound to me like a violation of the First Amendment. Like they're just absolute, they're forever, there's no exceptions, that's a little too much. So George decided to break the silence long enough, and in addition to talking to the first lawyer, he decided to include his 3 colleagues on the executive committee. So I have a picture of them too. So then he had 3 other people on this with him. And the 4 of them talked about this, and they decided that they were going to engage the ACLU, and they were going to bring their own lawsuit, and they were going to become John Does. Now, this was a gutsy thing to do, but it also felt awful because they couldn't tell the rest of their board. George had made an exception to the point of just telling the other people on the executive committee, because bringing litigation is kind of a big deal on behalf of an organization. So the 4 of them are bringing this lawsuit, and they're not allowed to say who they are. So imagine what it's like to keep that kind of secret. One of George's colleagues, who I recently met, Peter Chase, was saying that he had a son who was 13 years old, and the FBI apparently wasn't that careful about contacting people at home. And his son kept saying, Dad, why is the FBI after you? And Peter said he was horrified to realize he could not answer his son honestly. He wasn't allowed to tell him. So they would, these people would be at librarian meetings where everybody was giving John Doe awards and standing and giving them standing ovations, and they had to kind of, and you pretend that it wasn't them because they weren't allowed to say. So one of the absolutely ridiculous things that happened during the Library Connection litigation, which was pending in Connecticut, first of all, they were kind of shocked to realize that they weren't allowed to go to the courtroom because nobody was allowed to know who they were. So they set up a closed-circuit TV thing where they could be in Bridgeport while the court in Hartford was hearing their case, and they could hear what was happening. And then what happened was that somebody in the government had not been very careful. So documents were posted on the court's website that were supposed to be redacted so you couldn't tell who the plaintiffs were. But somebody did a very careless redaction, and they left in a description of Peter Chase that could only have been him, the chair of the Intellectual Property Committee of the. So an enterprising New York Times reporter put 2 and 2, 1 and 1 together. It was pretty easy, and she publishes an article about how the Library Connection people were not allowed to say who they were. But guess what? It's the Library Connection. So at that point, George and Peter and all still can't say yes or no. They're still, standing there mum as reporters are trying to talk to them, saying, no comment. But what happened at that point was that the lawyers said to the court, well, now that the cat is out of the bag, could they please testify before Congress? Well, the government lawyers said no. They said, we're going to take down those bad, hastily redacted documents from the website, and we're going to put up more carefully redacted documents, and we're just going to proceed, because the cat isn't really out of the bag. How does anyone know whether that's really who they are or not? So literally, these are some arguments that, I think when people get overzealous, like they think they're doing the right thing, and it's, by any means necessary. So some of these arguments I think are kind of ridiculous. But one of the things that they said was, well, okay, so the New York Times published the name Library Connection, but studies show, they say, that 58% of people don't really believe what they read in newspapers. Anyway, they said people in Connecticut don't read the New York Times. It's a whole different state. So, there was secret, some of the things that were embargoed, that nobody was allowed to, that were filed in the court under seal, were quotes from Supreme Court opinions, and the New York Times article, that had to be filed in the court under seal. So it was, kind of nuts, but the Library Connection people litigated for 9 months, and at the end of that time, they were finally allowed to say who they were after the Patriot Act renewal hearings had ended. Now, you may know that in the fall of 2001, because Congress had not taken the time to have hearings or debates or testimony, they were just sort of throwing in all these new measures to give the government more and more powers, because they just had ideas, well, maybe we could do this, maybe we could do that. They hadn't really had hearings on any of this. So what they did was, with some of the more controversial provisions, they had the provision sunset after 4 years, which meant that 4 years later, Congress would look at the provision, and unless Congress decided to renew the provisions, it would just expire. So that's where George Christian and John Doe wanted to testify, to say to Congress, don't renew this provision. This is a bigger deal than you realize. The Attorney General is saying, they're just hysterical. Well, we're not hysterical. There are things going on. This is a concern. So it wasn't until after the renewal hearings, when the Patriot Act was renewed, that George and his colleagues were allowed to testify. George said, it's like calling the fire department after the house is burned down. So there's the Library Connection. They were amazing people, amazing, I think, American heroes. And one of the things that I really wanted to do in this book was to show that in addition to being victims of post-9/11 anti-terrorism measures, we also have a lot of American heroes. There are a lot of people who really stood up and defended the Constitution because they saw that no branch of the federal government was doing it. So now, flashback to the original John Doe, this internet service provider. I'll now tell you his name, because after 6 years I finally can tell you his name. His name is Nicholas Merrill, and he ran a small internet service company called Calyx, and he was doing very well. He had among his clients Snapple and IKEA and Democracy Now!, and he was really having great success. But when he got a request for information about one of his clients, he was very troubled. He didn't go to Harvard, but he went to Hampshire College, where they also knew about the Constitution. So he had taken a constitutional law class, and he said when he saw this national security letter, he was very troubled because there was no court or no judge's signature. He said, how can this be? How can the government be asking for this sensitive information without a judge's signature? Now, librarians are one thing. Think about what your internet service provider knows about you. In these days of cloud computing, it's all with them. Your whole life, your calendars, your photos, everything. Not just what music you like, but everything. So he was very concerned about this. So he came to say, again, despite the fact that the statute said, don't ever tell anybody anything, whatever, ever, about the fact that you've received this demand, he went to see a lawyer at the ACLU, and he told me the first question that he asked the lawyer was, if I challenge the government on this, is somebody going to put me in a bag and drag me away? And the lawyer said, well, I can't really tell you what's going to happen. And he decided he was going to do it anyway. So, 6 years of litigation. Nick is pretty irrepressible, let me tell you. See, he found ways to communicate anyway. He wrote an anonymous op-ed for the Washington Post in 2007. This is 3 years into the litigation now. And he described living under this regimen of silence as stressful and surreal. Quote, when I meet with my attorneys, I cannot tell my girlfriend where I am going or where I have been. I hide any papers related to the case where she will not look. They broke up. She had a feeling he was hiding something from her. When clients and friends ask me whether I am the one challenging the constitutionality of the NSL statute, I have no choice but to look them in the eye and lie. So that's what John Doe did for 6 years. But because of his litigation, there were some very minor changes that Congress made after reading about the judge's opinion in his case to the gag orders. And what they said is, we didn't really mean that you weren't allowed to talk to a lawyer or go to a court. You could do that. And then they also started this procedure which says, okay, well, so if you want to be able to talk about the experience of getting a national security letter, here's what we'll do. Elaborate procedure, elaborate procedure, elaborate procedure. You can go to the court and you can prove this, and then they do that, and then the board, and all this legalistic stuff. And bottom line, but if the government says no, that's it. So the whole idea was that the gag orders were supposed to be selective, and the FBI and whoever were supposed to be using these only where it really was necessary for national security. But another common theme after at the 9/11, who got to decide whether it was absolutely necessary? They did. And they didn't have to give the court a chance. The court got a little bit of a chance, but they could say to the court, no, we're just not going to let you do it here. And they got the final decision. It's like the state secrets privilege, right? We're not going to let the court litigate it. We know better. So even though the initial gag orders applied to 100% of the national security letters and the library provision, they're still being used in 97%. So there's still this massive secrecy. So, starting from John Ashcroft's, we've never used this provision at all. By the time Attorney General Gonzales testified at the Patriot Act renewal hearings, he told Congress that the, quote, library provision had been used 35 times, but never in a library. Okay, so people thought, oh, well, it's a tiny little amount and never libraries, and isn't that fine? He didn't mention the national security letters. Because of Nick Merrill's lawsuit, because of the John Doe lawsuit, things happened, and there was a wonderful expose in the Washington Post by a reporter named Barton Gellman, who's also written books, maybe some of which are here. And Barton Gellman reported George Christian's experience before George was allowed to talk about it, and he could, because he wasn't under the gag order. And the other thing that he reported, he had done a little research, and he discovered that the national security letters had been used a little bit more often than 35 times. He gave the figure of 30,000 a year. 30,000 requests a year, but that was much lower than the figure that it ultimately turned out. We now have Inspector General studies and reports on this because finally Congress woke up like 8 years after putting this into effect and had the Inspector General do a study, and there have been hundreds of thousands of national security letter requests, most of which are to telecommunications providers, internet service providers, telephone companies about phone numbers, etc. Now, what I think is really very interesting is that out of those hundreds of thousands of requests, you know how many people, to our knowledge, have ever stood up to the government and said, wait a minute? 6. John Doe, Nick Merrill, the 4 people at the Library Connection, and one other guy named Brewster Colley who came to the ACLU. He was with the Internet Archive, so he's sort of both an internet service provider and a librarian, both. So I think that's extremely interesting that that people, there are a few people who really stood up to all this, but there are also many who did not. The final thing that I think I'll tell you before I open this up to question and answer and see what you want to talk about is that there's a lot in the Patriot Act that's all about the government getting information about you. A lot of people who question, including the 9/11 Commission staff, they've questioned whether this actually is making us any safer. Somebody said if you're trying to find a needle in a haystack, it doesn't help to add more hay. You have to have the algorithms to know how to research all the data and find terrorists, and we don't really know what patterns for terrorism because it doesn't happen that often. But in addition to the government having all these options for getting information about you directly, and at least they're supposed to be limited by the Constitution, there also is this tremendous partnership that goes on between the government and private corporations and all of private society, where the government, in addition to getting this kind of information directly, often they'll ask telecommunications providers or other people who've been gathering information, airlines, to just turn over information, and often private industry does. You remember the whole scandal about the National Security Agency surveillance, where all the telecoms were turning over information, even though it was illegal at the time for the government to ask, except Quest. That one did stand up to them. And the government can also just buy information from data aggregators. So there's this whole sprawling thing that happens in the corporate world and financial institutions. Are any of you familiar with Patriot Act compliance software? Okay, if you're in a financial institution, Kevin's saying yes, he knows about this. You have to know your customer, you gather information for the government, then they can require you to search your records to give them information, and they can require you to check lists to make sure you're not doing business with anybody who's on one of their terrorist watch lists, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this whole, in addition to the librarians being conscripted as government agents, we also have all the financial institutions and companies and private people being conscripted. So, as if that doesn't go far enough, where I want to close is with a Boston resident. I don't know if he still lives here, but he did at the time. And this was a guy who had moved to the United States from Egypt as a child when he was 7 years old. And he had been living uneventfully in Boston for decades. He was 30-something. He had a job, he had a bank, he was having a nice life. And one day he gets this letter from his bank, Fleet Bank. We regret to inform you that we have decided that it is not in our best interest to continue your banking relationship with us. He was fired by his bank. Why? Could never figured it out, because he's a Muslim. So he decided to stand up. He told the press about this. But there it is, so that's part of the things that I talk about, and this is, many other areas that I could talk about. Okay, so I want to end there, and I want to see what questions you have. So questions, comments? Don't be shy. Sir.
What would you say to the idea that once these freedoms are lost, that the opportunity to recover them is pretty close to zero? And that they really will change the whole structure and nature of this country, its relationship to the Constitution, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
That this is like a permanent change, and at best you may get some changes around the margins that sort of go back to the freer system that we had, but it's essentially gone.
Well, I think historically what you're saying is really right. And one of the reasons, the ACLU did a whole report about Obama's first half of his term, which they called the new normal. And the idea is if you're into a second presidency, you've switched occupants of the White House and you're still doing all the same things. And by the way, Obama did try to change Guantanamo and harsh interrogation techniques. But on all these issues, when he was a candidate, he said, no more national security letters. Now that he's president, he thinks they're just fine. He apparently trusts himself to use this power. But what's interesting is I think historically you're right, these powers just keep incrementally building. A lot of what people think was in the Patriot Act started with Bill Clinton in the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act after the Oklahoma bombing in 1996. So you're right, things, once the powers are in there, they do tend to stay rooted and we change who we are. I don't think, especially given the Congress that we have right now, where they can't agree on lunch, I don't think a lot of this is about to be reversed tomorrow. But I don't think that means that we should not find out about what's going on and not care. Because if we in this room don't know what's happening, and if we don't care, and if we don't start pushing back, nobody will. And I think there's an incremental process here where at least you can start. One thing that happens, I think, is when Obama and Congress keep having more and more and more dragnets, it's because they think that's what we want. They think, and a lot of people are just being fooled. They think, oh, well, I'm happy to give up some liberty for security. Sure, I'll give up some freedom in order to be safe. What they don't realize is they're giving up the liberty, but they're not getting anything for it. And very often, what they're actually doing is giving up somebody else's liberty. There's a whole other story in here about the most serious impacts being against Muslims. So we were actually talking about this. Carol Rose, who's the executive director of the ACLU of Massachusetts, was saying, and I thought this was a great answer. She said, one reason why we really have to find out about this and care is that in the future, if somebody says to you, did you know about this? What were you doing? You want to have an answer to that. You don't want to say, I just went along. I was like the hundreds of thousands of telecommunications providers. I said, okay, whatever. But, I think it's important. I think there has been a kind of sea change. And it happens little by little, who we are. Other comments, questions?
I thought the proportion of people who received these letters and stood up and had something to say about it was stunning.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Anyone have a sense of why that is? Why don't more people stand up?
I think one of the things is people think that this is in place and they don't dare stand up.
Uh-huh. Yeah, will someone put me in a sack and drag me away,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
So Ben Weisman from the National Security Program was here last week.
Oh,
And
great.
He was on a panel and he said, nobody's explained to me yet why acts of terrorism are different from other crimes that we try and prosecute here in the United States. And I wonder if you think that terrorism actually should be considered more like other sorts of crimes that we prosecute here, and if they like probable cause standards that we have and other standards that we have to guide police discretion and FBI behavior are reasonable and enough to deal with the terrorism.
Well, I think that's right, and I think one of the places where we went wrong after 9/11, there's a whole other sets of laws, a lot of other things I talk about here. But one of the things that happened in addition to this sort of move toward much greater surveillance with much less restriction on the government and much less oversight, there are also a number of places, criminal laws, where the government wanted to use prevention rather than punishment as their model. So the idea was that instead of waiting until you do something wrong, and then we'll prosecute you and we'll have probable cause to arrest you and proof beyond a reasonable doubt and all the things we're accustomed to, their idea is, no, we need a totally different model, and we have to be able to prevent people from doing things, and therefore we can't wait until we have probable cause, until we have enough evidence. Now, one of the things that I try to document is how dangerous that is. The ACLU had one man who was a client who was arrested as, quote, a material witness in one case because the government recognized that they just didn't have enough evidence to really arrest him. So they used this material witness statute that said if you need somebody's testimony in a case and you think they're about to become unavailable, you can arrest them for a very limited amount of time to make sure you have their testimony. Where did he ever testify? No place. They never asked him to testify, but they just kind of used that as an excuse. And that to me is very frightening, the whole idea that we're dealing with something that's not like crime and therefore we just have to do everything differently. I mean, some people talk about crime versus war. That's not even what you do in a war. Your wars are circumscribed. There's a theater of war. The war has a finite end. Terrorism never has an end. When does terrorism end? And what are its geographic limits? So I think it's very concerning, and I think that a lot of people in this country either don't really understand what's happened to the law and how things have changed because a lot of this is below the surface. I think a lot of people feel like everything must be okay now that Obama is president. But even if you trust him for how he's going to use the powers, there are going to be presidents after Obama. And if you can't change this while you have a constitutional law professor in the White House, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So I think what has to happen, if we're not going to sort of slide into a kind of a Stasi kind of state, or Orwellian, Kafkaesque, whatever your favorite literary allusion is, people have to say, wait a minute, I want to find out more about this, and I want to tell my representatives, don't assume that you're doing this for me. Don't treat me, this is all very infantilizing. Just trust the government, we know what's best. We're going to decide what rights you need to give up because we're keeping you safe. The 9/11 Commission says no president can promise to keep us safe. Terrorists actually somehow they think of different ideas the next time, and we're always fighting the last battle. So other comments, lady in the back.
It's troubling to do what you said here, that when it came to the terrorists themselves that blew up the Trade Center, World Trade Center, and so on, that information seemed to get lost through the cracks, as if you recall. So the security network wasn't effective just leading up to this,
Right.
evidently. And then after that, how many years was it take to find Osama bin Laden, with this worldwide dragnet? And so there is this very troubling kind of imposition on the citizens, and it's also troubling that it seems to be directed all over the world toward Muslims, and that's, we don't need that right now, but it doesn't seem to be an effective thing against terrorism anyway.
Yeah.
So have they rethought, is anybody gonna bring this up one of these days, that this is huge and terribly expensive and very damaging, but it's not effective?
Well, it's a great question, and that's what we're not doing. And that's why I wrote this book. I thought maybe the 10th anniversary of the Patriot Act is the time when we could start saying, well, wait a minute, why are we doing these things? I could tell you long stories of, that we don't have time for now, but they're in there, about, one assumption that was started in the fall of 2001 was that the real problem, the way that we were going to get control of terrorism, was that we were going to choke off the financing. And therefore, because there was a pipeline of money flowing from mosques in Brooklyn to Al-Qaeda, and that was really the problem, what we would do is we would heavy up on everybody. We would shut down all the Muslim charities in America. We would make everybody, do watch list checking and all this, and make every company spend an incredible amount of money on anti-money laundering, compliance, et cetera, and all this data, and all these ideas about, well, let's do all these things. Well, all the experts tell us, and this is now actually confirmed by WikiLeaks, things we know from all over the world now, the money wasn't never coming from the United States. Terrorists are financed by people, over where they are, and it just wasn't true. And there are a lot of places where, my jaw drops when you hear things that the Treasury Department says about, oh, well, those charities, they're financing Al-Qaeda. Well, no. And the charities are really suffering. There are a lot of not-for-profits. They try to all get together and negotiate with the Treasury Department about, things that are happening to them. They're really having a lot of problems. I'm resisting telling you all more stories because I don't want to take too much time. But, it really is a problem. And I think that the other thing, what you're saying too, it's not even just, we don't know that some of these things are effective at all, because some of it may be based on a misdiagnosis of what we thought in the fall of 2001 that didn't turn out to actually be true. They may not be cost effective. I just read the alarming statistic that Carol Rose had, that we spend more money on anti-terrorism than all the countries in the world combined. And then there's the question of counterproductive. The ACLU did a report a couple of years ago called Blocking Faith, Freezing Charity, which was all about the impact on Muslims of all of this enforcement. And there are a lot of Muslims who are terrified to give to any charity because the FBI was showing up, infiltrating their mosques, showing up at people's doors, saying, oh, you gave money to this charity, what about that one, and why? And then they would come back the next year and say, oh, you gave money to that charity again. And you have tremendous chill on freedom of religion, free exercise of religion. But the other thing was that, some people were saying, we'd like to help the FBI. We would like to help out if we see anything that we think is suspicious, but at this point we're getting afraid of them. They're treating us all like we're suspects. So there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about counterproductive. And what I worry about is I think that there's a lot of ostrich going on. A lot of people are putting their heads in the sand and not wanting to worry a lot or think about or interrogate. Is the government really doing things that are effective, that are cost effective? Are they doing the right things? And I just think it's about time to talk about that and to really ask those questions. We have at this point, to coin a phrase, it's like faith-based anti-terrorism. It's not evidence-based. It's just somebody once said that, and so that's what we keep doing. You get agencies that do that, and they keep doing it, even though we don't know. Other questions or comments?
Yes, it's a comment. First, really, thank you so much for all the knowledge that you brought. You have a wonderful memory, and thank you for not reading. I come from a country where nobody reads when they talk, and I am fascinated to see your capacity to have so much good memory and all the knowledge. Thank you for all the knowledge.
Oh, well, thank you. What country are you from?
Yes, I am from the Basque Country.
Oh.
I want to come in a 4th century scholar, San Ambrose, very famous and to specialism for his ideas. He says, the institutional terrorism is the one, in 4th century, is the one who produced subversive terrorism. The institutional terrorism is the one who is producing the subversive terrorism.
Yeah.
And he says, to complete the sentence, he says, crime is committed by a person we call crime, horrible crime. It's committed by the church or by the institutional government we call heroism and duty.
Well, another thing that doesn't seem to impress our Congress, great thought. Another thing that doesn't seem to impress our Congress very much is comparative experiences from around the world. Is Congress interested in what other countries do? Not really. And so we have pretty much of a disconnect. One of the things that I really like, the International Commission of Jurists sent around a panel called the Eminent Jurist Panel, which spent 3 years interviewing people in all different countries that had changed their laws in response to terrorism. Argentina, Ireland, Israel, India, you name it, United States. And their primary conclusion, Mary Robinson from Ireland was the chief, but there were judges and all sorts of people. And one of their chief conclusions was that countries that had changed their laws to respond to the challenges of terrorism, your question, did worse. That they would have been doing a lot better just to stick to the rule of law. Do we have time for one more question or comment? What?
Yes.
Okay, one more? Somebody different, or shall we? Sir.
A lot of us voted for Obama in the hope that a great many of these things would be ameliorated. We were disappointed to a very good extent. My question is, how much is he, in some ways, the prisoner of a system which he inherited? And how much effect, how much control does he have over changing that system?
Yeah. I think that's a great question because what Obama did, I'm sorry, the question is, the gentleman in the front said that a lot of people voted for Obama thinking that he was going to change a lot of what had been happening, and he really hasn't. So the question is, to what extent is he really a victim, a captive of what had happened before him, and to what extent is he really making choices? There's a very interesting book written by Jack Goldsmith, who was in the Department of Justice and was part of a lot of the incidents going on, called The Terror Presidency. And what he says is that very much the victim of circumstances approach. He says any president, whether Lincoln, Roosevelt, those of you who know history, Lincoln during the Civil War suspended habeas corpus. We know what Franklin Roosevelt did with the Japanese Americans during World War II. He says, and I think there's a lot to this, the pressures of the office. Everybody thinks that the president can keep them safe. And with the dialogue that goes on, the Republican-Democrat thing, if Obama gave up a single one of the powers that he inherited from George Bush and something happened, the Republicans would slaughter him. And so he doesn't want to move back, and he's sort of holding on to the powers that he has just in case. And I think in many ways, I don't want to say that his enforcement has been the same as George Bush. Under the Bush administration, there were a lot more concerns about prosecutions that targeted political dissidents, and there's not been as much of that under Obama. He's enforcing things differently. But the fact that he wants to keep all the dragnets, I think, is really somewhat short-sighted. So I do think that it's hard. I think the political inertia here, it's very difficult to change. And given that what Obama did try to do, his first day in office, he issued executive orders saying, I want to close Guantanamo, I want to end torture and harsh interrogation techniques. And you see what's been happening in Congress. They've been fighting back tooth and nail on that. They don't want him trying terrorism suspects in criminal court, in civilian court in this country. So he can't get it through Congress even if he wanted to do it. And I think it's not where he wants to spend his political capital. One last comment on that, which is also something that Jack Goldsmith says. Every morning, one thing that happens if you're the president is that you get a briefing. And you get the 35 things that might be terrorist plots around the country. Do you remember that before Obama's inauguration, there was actually a threat of there was going to be a terrorist disruption of his inauguration? So before he was inaugurated, he's giving his inaugural address with all this in mind of, is this going to happen? And he's already been working with the Bush counterterrorism people. Plus, the other thing my husband says, I thought this is a great metaphor. It's like there are so many people who work for the federal government. The very top layer are the political appointees who Obama changed. Everybody else, all the way down, all the FBI people, the TSA people, are the same people who were there. The lawyers in the Justice Department are the same lawyers making the same state secrets privileges arguments. And my husband says, those giant tankers out to sea, it takes them 5 miles to turn around. Yeah, you can't just turn around the federal government like that, the Defense Department, et cetera. So I don't know whether that's encouraging, but what I think is encouraging is that, I think blaming Obama is hard. I'm not a person who says, the Andrew Bacevich line, George Bush was just doing this because he wanted to aggrandize the presidency. And, I think any president is under all this pressure that, people expect that the president can keep us safe. And, the 9/11 Commission says no president can promise that. It's not realistic. But, politically, you have to say to people what they want to hear. Government by focus groups. So let me pick up on your comment before I want to close with two things. Number one is I want to close with a quote from William Douglas, which is, I think, sort of where we are. A lot of the 9/11 coverage that you might have seen, if you looked at the coverage about civil liberties, of which there was some, people were saying, the New York Times says, this has been tremors, not earthquakes. Well, my view is you don't even have to categorize. Some people say, well, it's not as bad as what we did to the Japanese Americans during World War II, so we're okay. Well, not really comparative. But in my view, if you're feeling tremors, you have to start worrying about earthquakes. So, changing metaphors, this is what the ever-quotable William Douglas has to say. He says, as nightfall does not come all at once, neither does oppression. In both instances, there is a twilight when everything remains seemingly unchanged. And it is in such twilight that we must all become most aware of change in the air, however slight, lest we become unwitting victims of the darkness, which is your question. Okay, so Linda Greenhouse says, as Ryan quoted, call to action. I'm calling on all of you to tell 3 people not here tonight, gee, here's what I learned. Listen to what's going on. You find out more, talk back to your representative, say, wait a minute, why are we spending all this money on this? Do we really know if it's working, if it's counterproductive? Now, in order not to end on too down a note, however, my friends are saying to me, so this is my first out-of-town tryout, and people are already saying, so are you having fun on your book tour? And I feel like, here I am being Cassandra and saying to people, wake up, the country's eroding, and here it is. So I think I want to end on a lighter note by telling you that, I don't know how many of you have had the occasion to write a book or anything like that, but there's also something to the whole process, since we're surrounded by all these books, of writing a book that really is fun. And so I wanted to tell you, this was a cartoon in the New Yorker years ago that's always been one of my favorites about the process of writing a book and the rewards that you're sort of looking ahead to while you're doing it, the things that keep you going. You'll see how old this is in a minute. So in the cartoon, there's a guy sitting on the porch of a house, which is clearly like in Martha's Vineyard or someplace like that. And he's sitting at a table with a typewriter. That's how old it is. And all around on the floor are crumpled up pieces of paper, and he has his head in his hands. And a woman, clearly meant to be his wife, is saying to him, all right, let me go over it once again. The New York Times says, brightest new voice in fiction we've had for decades. Elaine calls up and finds out if you want a personal table reserved for you at her restaurant. Bill Moyers wants to plan a special feature on your life and thought. Now hit those keys. So being here here tonight. You know, I was writing. George knows, my brother. I was writing this book, and it's like in a page after page coming out of the word processor, not the typewriter. Some of them crumpled up, etc. And now it's a book, and this is like, you know, the fantasy. You're at the Harvard bookstore doing your book event and saying to everyone, "Here's my book." So thank you all for being here and for helping me to celebrate. Thank you. I guess Ryan is going to tell you that we could do book signing.
Sorry?
Are you going to tell them we could do book
Yes.
signing?
If you hadn't heard, we can do a book signing here at this table. And we have copies of Taking Liberties available at the registers behind you. And I thank you for coming.